Been up since 3:30 this morning, so we'll see. I had a 7 a.m. flight out of Portland, so yeah, it was a little challenging.
It's exhausting book tours. Are we good? Hey everybody, welcome to another Poison Pen podcast event. My name's Patrick, and I am the science fiction fantasy selector here at the store. Today, I am very lucky to have in person since before COVID, the wonderful author Rebecca Roanhorse. Rebecca, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, it's nice because, Rebecca, you've been writing for quite a number of years now, and you've developed a pretty great fan base, devoted fan base. So when you start doing events like this, you know that friends and family from all over the world are coming around to see you and to celebrate your writing. How has this book tour been since you haven't toured since COVID? I don't think.
That's right. Yeah. So I think the last time I toured was in 2019 with Race to the Sun. And
Yeah.
I actually came to Poison Pen. But yeah, we haven't been out on the road since COVID. And so it's been awesome to be out and be able to see people and in person. It's just a different energy. Like, no offense to everyone on Zoom out there, but it feels good to be in a room with people and to be able to interact and, give energy and they give energy back. And just to sort of see what the world is up to.
Exactly. And get to see your fans in person, face to face, since, your last couple of books, which have been phenomenal, by the way. I mean, you've really knocked the last few out of the park. And this one is particularly good. For those of you who don't know, we're actually here to discuss Tread of Angels, which actually this is the debut week for your book. This is more of a novella for you, which is a little bit of a different take. I was expecting a 400-page science fiction fantasy epic, and instead I got a phenomenal novella, which was just as satisfying. It was a great bite of reading, and I've got to say it was really enjoyable. Now, this takes place in sort of a alternate Western history, a little bit of a gothic horror, if you will, a little bit of a different take from some of your writing. Can you talk a little bit about Goetia and the world itself?
Sure. So yes, I consider this a Western noir. This was kind of my take on the Old West, and it was inspired by a trip through Leadville, Colorado. We were driving through Leadville, and for those who don't know, it's the highest incorporated city in the lower 48. It is an old mining town that has sort of this outsized history. When it was booming, it was a silver mine, and people like the unsinkable Molly Brown from the Titanic made their wealth there. People like Oscar Wilde graced their opera stage. So it's got a much larger history than you would expect from this little tiny town. And it's surrounded by these huge, jagged mountains like the Rocky Mountains. And I thought, if angels were to fall to earth, this is where they would fall. And so, my mind is always in, sort of the Americas and redefining sort of what the Americas should look like or should feel like in sort of a fantasy setting. And I was never attracted to Westerns, being Black and Native. Like, that was just not, and a woman, like, that was not a place where I felt like our stories were being told. And so this was my chance to sort of reimagine this world, sort of the Western, from a marginalized perspective, but to make it fantasy, because that's what I do. I'm not a historian. I'm a storyteller. I write fiction, and this was my fictionalized version of the Old West.
It sort of played on me because I've been actually going through the FromSoft games, which are horror based, and one in particular, Bloodborne, has this really lovely Victorian horror element to it. And so I think I sort of took that away a little bit when I was reading this book, because it does have this really strong sort of horror element. Two sisters, Celeste and Marielle, who are the fallen angels who end up arriving in this town. One grows up in immense wealth, the other one in great poverty. And, how they manage to maintain a relationship or discover their relationship with each other It's fascinating. It really is. And can you go into a little bit about the sisters' relationship without going into too much spoiler territory?
Yeah, I'm gonna try not to spoil because it is a murder mystery, and I don't want to give it away. But yeah, so the town of Goetia, this fictional town, is the place where the descendants of fallen angels and angels reside. And the descendants of the fallen angels are the only ones that can see divinity, which is sort of what they mine to drive their technology. It's sort of a steampunk kind of feel. And there's two sisters, and they are mixed. So it's very much sort of a mixed kids kind of story, as I would say. And one is accused of murdering someone very important in the town, like one of the elect, one of the like elites. And they are not, part of elite society. They are part of the marginalized society, the fallen. And so her sister has to try to prove her innocence. And I was just drawn to the sibling relationships. I think sibling relationships are fascinating. If you read Fevered Star, there's a lot of sibling relationships in that. Certainly, for those characters, Narampa and Ochi, her brother, and then sort of a mirror of that, Akoa and his sister Isa. All these sort of complicated relationships with expectations and disappointment and I think they sort of mirror my own understanding of sibling relationships. I have two half sisters, one that I've never met, and one that I've met once. And she was very into Martha Stewart. And I was very not. And I was like, oh, we're not going to get along. And and then I have a brother that I grew up with, my adopted brother. And that's a entirely complicated relationship, too. So it's one of those things. I think people expect sibling relationships to be perhaps like sort of the purist, you share these life histories, these loves, it feels like it's going to work, but often they're the worst, right? Or at least the most complicated. And they can be, sort of this treasure, or they can be full of like disappointment and expectation and all of that sort of stuff. So I really am drawn to writing about them. And so that's what's going on here. I wanted to write about these two sisters and like you said, how they come to understand each other when they need each other the most.
That's exactly it. And what better way to do that than, within a mystery standpoint, and also you've got some great courtroom scenes in there as well, which I really thought was a lot of fun. So you get a bit of courtroom drama, you get the mystery element, you get the fantasy element, and you do it in such a tight and succinct fashion. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your writing is that you keep things very tight and very succinct throughout your entire books. You show rather than you tell. Um, do you feel like you could have written this book earlier in your career, or do you think that it took that time to sort of build up those author chops to get you writing as tight of a story as this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I will tell you. So I write short stories too, and I sort of love that length. It's sort of get in, gut punch, get out. Like you don't you world build, but in a different way. Keep it really tight. One idea, tell your story, and you're done. Novels, on the other hand, are sort of these lengthy affairs where you really get to world build. You really get to draw out the characters and the ideas and their lives. The novella needs everything that a novel needs, but you only get like 200 pages. So it really sucked. It was really hard. I was like, I don't know. Why did I do this again? This is really bad. But it worked out. So I'm glad it worked for you. I'm glad it was short. So it has an element of get in, tell the story, get out, but it also needs to do all the world building. And since I drew from sort of biblical mythology and the Old West, and I felt like a lot of these were tropes that we're already familiar with. It actually allows the reader to bring all that history to the world so that I don't have to do all the heavy lifting. So when I'm writing something like Black Sun or that whole series, I'm going to assume that people are not familiar with like pre-Columbian Mesoamerican cultures, and that I'm going to have to like um, sort of create those worlds from scratch, the food, the language, like everything to fill out the world. But for something like this, where I'm talking about angels and demons and, the Old West mining town and a very segregated society, this society is very segregated by class, which is sort of a metaphor for race. Um, I think people bring enough of themselves to the book that I'm allowed to do it in 200 pages. So yeah, it was a challenge. I enjoyed it, but I don't know that this would be the length that I would like choose over and over again.
It's funny though, because I think novellas are becoming more of a thing within fantasy and within science fiction, that we're starting to see more of a trend of, in between the big lengthy books, authors taking the time to kind of recharge themselves a little bit and maybe fulfill, I hate to say it, but fulfill part of your contract as well by doing the novella. But it seems like it grabs the readers and it grabs readers' attention, and sales for these kinds of the novella has increased substantially. I think of like Martha Wells' The Murder Bot, which is a really top selling novella series. So for you, is this something that you found recharging in terms of as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I'm still working on book 3 of the trilogy. It's a little late, but it'll be done like in a couple of weeks. It'll be in, and I like to work on more than one project at a time. When I'm just working on one project, it tends to slow. And people talk about writer's block, and I don't think I actually ever have real writer's block, but I do have sort of writer's fatigue. And sometimes I need to shift gears and do something else for a little while, but I don't want to be idle. So it helps to have a second project or a third project, some way to sort of shift out of the world that you're in and into a different world, but still being productive. So that was very helpful to actually have this, to sort of be able to step away. I think I was writing Fevered Star. I had just finished Fevered Star. And so I was able to step into this and do this. And then I have other small projects, like I write Marvel comics. And I write for TV, which is not a small project. That's like a massive undertaking, actually.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I like to do a number of different things, and so it is helpful to like have something else that you can shift gears into. And then come back fresh to the other project.
It is, and you are one of the busiest writers in the business right now. And do you ever fear being that busy ever is a detriment to your writing? That at one point in time you'll kind of feel that maybe that little bit of that drying up, or not at all?
Burnout. No, that's tough. If you'd asked me that question before COVID, I think I would probably have a different answer. I think COVID was very draining for everyone, but for creatives especially, I think it's hard to create when it feels like the world's falling apart and you don't
Yeah.
have you're not sure what's happening. Um, Part of me was like, yay, I never have to go anywhere, because I am an introvert and like being in my house and like just having all my stuff was like perfect. But as a writer, you need intake. Like you need to be
Mhm.
around people. You need to observe relationships. You need to observe people, the world, and this is where all your ideas, sort of come from. At least mine do, like from observation or from travel or from
Right.
seeing things, interacting with things. Like I was sitting on the airplane and they passed around these really cool salt packets, and I was like, oh, look at this cool salt packet, and I was like, oh, this could be a whole story. What if there were like some monster hunters and they needed salt and they were out of
Mhm.
salt, so they took the salt from the plane. Anyway, so then I spun like a whole, I'm going to do it for a short story actually. And so, just little things like that
Yeah.
sort of get your mind going in different ways. And so lockdown during COVID, we didn't have a lot of that. And so it was hard to create during that period. But hopefully I'm sort of coming out the other end. I've never felt really burned out because I have a lot of ideas. Like I started late. I'm old. I had like full careers, before I came to writing. I was a lawyer for 10 years. So, the courtroom scenes are actually more courtroom scenes in the first draft. And my editor was like, what's up with the courtroom? And I
Mhm.
was like, well, I watched a lot of Perry Mason. And I used to like spend every day in a courtroom. So I just really enjoy that. And he was like, well, yeah, it's more, Anyway, so I cut back on the courtroom scene. But yeah, so what was, I don't know, I'm babbling. But like, I had I had all these full careers, so came to writing late. Have a ton of stories to tell, like lots of ideas that I want to share, and my mind just feels fertile. Knock on wood, hopefully that stays that way. Um, and so yeah, so I'm happy to be writing. I feel blessed and honored to be in this space where I can tell stories and
Exactly. And you're a master's story crafter. You really are.
oh, thank
And
you.
I've always got to say that talking with writers, they always say writers have got to write.
Mm.
And uh, I, when Francine Matthews was here, we were talking about, well, what would you do if you didn't write? And she said, I'd have way crazy dreams if I wasn't writing. And I've got to say that that creative juice, that energy has to come out in some way. And one of the things that I love about your books is that you never take us to where we're expected.
Mm.
Um, in terms of that, do you surprise yourself when you're doing that? Do you take us because you're not expected, or do you figure out a good twist, or taking I don't know if I'm asking the question
Yeah,
quite
no, I
clearly.
understand what you're saying. Well, I do outline, so I do plan what I'm gonna write ahead of time. Except maybe not with short stories. Short stories, I'm just sort of going with the flow. They feel more emotional to me. And so I have a general idea of where I'm headed, but I don't necessarily know. With novels and like with this, I had an outline. I outline about 80%, and then I leave about 20% for the muse. Like, so like if something happens, I can like follow that. So I don't always stick to my outline. I'm not like strict about it. But I usually know how the story's going to end before I write it. So I'm writing toward an end. Um, so I forgot, what was your question? Did I answer that?
Well,
Oh, the twist
the
and that
twists,
sort of
yeah,
thing.
exactly, because you always do manage to take us someplace
Yeah.
that we're not really expecting to, and even creatively. I mean, I would have never thought of a fantasy set in Mesoamerica, or
Mm.
you know,
Oh,
uh,
that's all I ever wanted my whole life. Yeah, like I mean, I think I've told this before, but I grew up reading, all the typical fantasy. I grew up reading the Dragonlance Chronicles, one of my favorite. Yay, like Raceland, right? I love him. And I don't know, the Belgariad and Wheel of Time and all the traditional fantasies, and all they're all set in like a sort of like a pseudo Europe, right? And I always wanted to read a fantasy set in like pseudo America, like where
Mhm.
are pre-Columbian Americas, fantasies, like we have these histories and these stories and these places and advanced civilizations and people who studied the stars and just all of this stuff that felt ripe for
Mhm.
fantasy, for imagination, and you just didn't see it. And so for me to write Black Sun was really my dream. That was like, I'm going to write the fantasy that I always wanted to read. And so that's, sort of what it inspired that. And as far as like twists and things, gosh, I like to subvert tropes. So
Right.
tropes are very helpful. Tropes are sort of like your expectations, like um, what you see over and over in a story. And they help to define expectation and structure and all of that stuff. So there's nothing wrong with them. But it's good sometimes to take that and turn them on their head because you can sort of defy reader expectation.
That's
And you
exactly it.
can make, because people are expecting A, and then you're like, well, what if we go towards, Z or something and see where that goes? And then they're like, oh, and it makes for an enjoyable story.
It really does, and I think we're sort of in this golden age of fantasy and science fiction. I think of Asimov and in that time period, Tolkien, kind of the Silver Age, the
Mm.
beginnings of it. But now we're really beginning to expand into of fantasy literature that includes all shapes, sizes, and races. And it really excites me to see because there's so many different books out there, um, and authors really getting the chance to flex their creative spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. And genders, by the way. I just got to add
Yeah,
that.
100%. Absolutely. And for instance, one of my top books of the year was Nona the Ninth by Tasman
Oh,
Muir.
yeah.
And, who knew that lesbian necromancers in space would be a thing and that it would work so well
Yeah.
as a action-packed fantasy series,
Yeah.
with elements of Agatha Christie of all people, and et cetera, to go on. And yours as well. Your books, especially the Between the Earth and Sky, I feel are great fantasy thrillers on
Mm.
top of everything else. Um, is your intent to? Did you want to bring in that thriller element? Was that kind of the ticking time bomb that was in Black
Mm.
Rain and Fevered Star? Was that? Um,
Yeah, so Black Sun actually does literally have a clock that's like ticking down to the convergence where all the characters and action is all going to come together and someone's going to live, someone's going to die, something's going to happen. And so I did make a conscious effort to add that for pacing reasons, right? Because it felt good. It feels, because I don't know, epic fantasy is one of those things. Like if you're an epic fantasy reader and you're down for, like your long, 400 or 500 pages of like, this is what we ate, 6 pages of meals, that sort of thing. That's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that my readers are a little more contemporary, like have expectations
yeah.
about pace and how things are going to move. And so I wanted that story to feel like it was moving. And so, yeah, I sort of borrowed that idea from a thriller. I did not do that in Fevered Star. And of course, then people were like, well, the pacing is a little slow. and I was like, and I was like, well, I know, but I want you to spend 6 pages thinking about the meals for this one. But anyway, but yeah.
Do you think that type of fantasy though is kind of do you think that writers are moving away from that classic trope, that super epic fantasy where we do have the 6 pages of meals and the 12
Oh,
pages of walking and
gosh. I don't know. Brandon Sanderson is still here. He's still
yeah.
creating and doing just fine. So maybe not. A little bit. I guess, people have, I will say this. We watch a lot of TV, and TV pacing creates expectations about how a story is going to move. And so when people come from TV to books, they bring those expectations with them. And often books are much slower for obvious reasons. And so I think that does impact like how people write.
Well, yeah, and there's a particular fantasy that Amazon has recently produced into a show that people complained about the pacing. They, in terms of
Oh.
they paced like a book versus pacing like a television show, and they got
Mhm.
a little bit lambasted for that. I myself enjoyed it, but I can understand where it isn't for everybody's cup of tea.
Right.
Um, but yeah, in terms of that, maybe writing for television and maybe being a lawyer helped with kind of shaping you as a fantasy writer, do you think?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think everything goes into the pot, as they say. So, all my years of so like for this book, I have a degree in theology. I have a master's degree in theology, and I studied religious studies undergrad. And so this was my chance to like play with all those ideas. Plus, I just like urban fantasy. I think at the end, I was like, none of the academic stuff made it into the book. It's all just like hot demon lords. But certainly my interest in theology, and I think that shows through like Black Sun and with everything as well, and clearly the legal background, although very very brief, is in there. And writing for TV is, hmm, it's very different. Actually, I'm lucky enough that Black Sun has been optioned by AMC. Yay! Working with Angela Kang of The Walking Dead, and I've drafted the pilot. We are still a long way till we're actually on TV. um, who knows? But writing that, and working with, and I've been in a couple of writers' rooms, which has been great, and sort of seeing how that process works, and how to be more of a visual storyteller. Because my first notes are always like, the characters don't have to say everything that they're thinking. It's okay, Rebecca. You can just like have them give a look, or I don't know, a nod, or I don't know, whatever. But I'm always like, okay, fine. But how are people gonna know what they're thinking? Because in a book, I can tell you what they're thinking. But in a TV script, that no, you can't do that. Like it's just it's slow, and it's
Right.
wordy, and my drafts are very long, and they're like, no one's gonna produce this. It's too long. But so I think I bring all those, hopefully those skills to my writing. So and I always want to be getting better. I don't want to stagnate as a writer. I want things to progress.
We had one of the major writers for Arrow within
Oh
the last
yeah.
couple seasons here a couple years ago, right before the pandemic. She had written a series of young adult, and she says writing for television is way different, and dealing with studio executives and people in Hollywood is really a different sort of beast in and of
100%.
itself.
100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very different from publishing.
Um, are there parts of the Hollywood process that you prefer?
Oh, so I think the exciting thing about being in a writer's room is the collaboration. So sometimes you want to collaborate. And when you're in this room with a bunch of other creative people who are writers and have ideas, when you hit that zone where like someone's like, what about this? And then you bounce off that and you're like, oh, what about this? And, the ideas are flowing and it's really sort of like the best idea wins, like in,
Hmm.
in an ideal situation. Sometimes there's like politics and hierarchy and all that stuff. But at least, there are moments where everybody's working together to come up with the best story possible. And all these other
Right.
wonderful minds are like at work with yours. And that's very cool. But then sometimes you just want to be alone and you think
Hmm.
you know the best story and you want to tell the story that you want to tell and you don't want all these other people like trying to like, change your story, which certainly in Hollywood there's yeah, your name might be on the episode, but that doesn't mean any of your words or any of your ideas like made it onto the screen. Like it's it's
Now,
it's by committee.
now, can I ask what shows you've been working on?
I was in the writers' room for Echo, which is a Marvel series that's going to come out on Disney Plus. Very excited about that. And then I was in the writers' room for an FX show. That I'm not sure. It was called The Retreat when I was working on it. It's by the folks who did the OA. So I don't know if you watched the OA on Netflix, but I got to work with them. Yeah.
So that must have been a lot of fun, and eventually you get to see it come out. I've heard Disney is a completely different beast from working with any other type of Hollywood group.
Yeah, but this
Um,
was Marvel, so it'll
yeah,
be on Disney Plus. But it was Marvel, so it was all the folks that from all the famous names that from Marvel.
it's exciting.
Yeah, had thoughts. So it's challenging.
So, in terms of sexy demon lords, because we haven't gotten into that, writing sex and sexy demons is always a good thing to add um, into your urban fantasy, so to speak. And I'm finding that a lot more romantic tropes are getting put into urban fantasy, which is really a lot of fun. Actually, a lot of urban fantasy is also romantic suspense or romance, or a good half, fantasy, half
Yeah,
romance.
absolutely.
Um, is it a lot of fun to write those sexy demon lords and get them into the plot and keep them moving along?
Yeah. So I love urban fantasy. Like I grew up on epic fantasy, but really kind of pulled away from it in college and like so as I got a little older, because it really wasn't speaking to me. But then I discovered urban fantasy, and actually the way I discovered it was in an airport bookstore. I remember going in. And I saw a Laurel K. Hamilton book on the bookshelf. I don't know if you know who she is, but she writes sort of these Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series in the 90s, I think, right? So I think they're still around, but
Yeah.
whether they should be or not, I'm not going to comment. But I remember I picked up the book and I was reading the back because I forget the name of it now, but it had a cool name and a cover. And I was reading it and I was like, Anita Blake Vampire Hunter, will she choose between her werewolf lover or her vampire lover? And I was like, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And I bought that book and I was like, oh, this whole world opened up to me, this urban fantasy, with like female leads. And often there's like romantic complications, but there's also like murder and there's, yeah, and monsters and sexy times and like all sorts of stuff. And it really spoke to me as like a young woman who loved fantasy but wanted something different than the same epic fantasy by the same old white dudes. Bless their hearts, but
Yep.
I wanted something a little different.
I think it really took romance writers to break in to doing some of the urban fantasy that took us away from some of what we traditionally call fantasy novels. I remember a customer from the library that I had worked at years ago loved Laurel K. Hamilton. She's like, you got to read Laurel K. Hamilton. She's fantastic. She's one of the best authors I've ever read. And so she's like, she gave me a copy of Kiss of Shadows, which is the PI series that she wrote. And that one, a lot of mystery, little sex. By book 4, man, there was
It's just all.
it was just all sex. Um,
Those are not my faves. Like I liked when it was a mystery and there was a
Yeah.
murder to be solved, and there's all this like vampire court politics, very Interview with a Vampire
Right.
influence, the vampire world, and and the werewolves would actually like eat each other, and like they're like showdowns, and so stuff like that. It was very fun and very interesting, and it was the '90s, so this I don't know that it's aged so well, but she was doing something really interesting and different. Yeah.
She was pushing the envelope before writers could really push the envelope, and it just opened itself up for all sorts of different. That's okay.
Don't eat it.
Oh, Paul, just smell it.
Oh, okay.
You're good. So for those of you who might not be able to see, Paul, my dog, is looking at us, hopefully on camera, as if it's a treat. So in terms of characters, do you have a favorite character in Shred of Angels? Somebody that you want the reader to really glom onto?
Oh, well, definitely Sexy Demon Lord, Abraxas. Yeah, he was a lot of fun to write. Like, I love to write a villain, and I like a complicated villain. Um, I don't know that he's the villain per se, but he is a demon. He was one of the Lords of Hell, who was part of the army during the War on Heaven, when Lucifer and his minions challenged God and the angels. And he has stayed after the war. Of course, Lucifer loses. One of the angels falls to earth, and his body rots and becomes this like mineral that the people of Goetia mine, for their technology, as I mentioned. And Abraxas has stayed behind to sort of guard his lord's dead body. And he has a steamy, complicated affair with the protagonist of the story, Celeste. And he wants her soul and her body. And she is fighting against that, against his seduction throughout the book. So yeah, he was a lot of fun to write.
He is, and you and you get a little steamy there. You do manage to
little
get
bit.
a little bit.
Yeah, so there's sort of this thing where a lot of women who write fantasy are considered YA, and even when we're not writing YA, we're writing adult. I've actually never written a YA book, but you wouldn't know that, right? And so we have this joke sort of in the science fiction fantasy community. Like at some point, every woman has been accused of writing YA. And we're like, how do we get out of that? We're like, write all the sex, put all the sex in the book, and then they will not call it YA, but they still do. So anyway, so yeah, so it's a little bit steamy. And I think you're going to find that Mirrored Heavens, the third book in Between Earth and Sky, might be a little bit steamy as well. Just shake it up a little bit, and it's part of who the characters are. I think it's true to the story, and it's important to storytelling. It's not just to get out of that.
That's exactly it. It plays an important part of the book, and it really does, because it gives you the idea of what sort of peril Celeste is in. She's as much in peril for her soul as she is physically within this.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I think that that's a lot of fun. Now, talking about being a religious studies, is there a particular religion or location that you'd like to write about next, do you think?
Oh, no. I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, let's see what comes to mind. I know that my next book after I finish the Between Earth and Sky series is actually going to be, I'm going to return sort of to climate fiction. And it's, I told someone this the other day, and they just like looked at me like I was very strange. So hopefully I got to get my elevator pitch down for it. But I'm writing about mafia families who control the weather. So it's going to be like the futuristic Southwest, where mafia families employ these people who are able to control the weather, either through like their traditional ways or through technology.
and in the Southwest, we think about climate change an awful lot. I think, I don't know about you, but this summer was awfully hot, and,
Hmm.
we're getting less and less water.
Yes.
Where you live and where we are here in Phoenix, it's just, water is a huge issue. A lot of people don't realize, being on the East Coast or,
Right.
how much water is a commodity for us.
Right. Because the people who gave me the look were in Seattle, and so they get plenty of rain, right? Although they haven't recently, so they should be concerned. But yeah, and I had written this article, or written, I had read this article in the New York Times about cloud seeding and
Mhm.
how countries are competing to seed clouds. And we don't even know if the technology really works. But what's happening is like Saudi Arabia, is seeding a cloud, and then a neighboring country will accuse them of quote stealing their rain. And so there's actually like this competitive thing, and there's like spies involved, and other countries, the United States, are secretly trying to like take rain away from other people or give rain to people, and so it's actually already
Mhm.
happening. This that sounds like science fiction, but it's very real. I'm going to turn it into something with
Mhm.
fiction, but you have these countries competing for rain already.
Absolutely. And it's such a, I don't know, it's such an important subject here.
Yes, yeah.
The more rain, more snow that we can get, we are just desperate this year for a really cold, wet, snowy winter up in Flagstaff, because that'll supply us with enough water to help rebuild Lake Mead. I mean, you're finding all sorts of
Oh,
fun
right.
bodies, right? Things that
Fun
the mob
bodies.
may, some things maybe the mob had left behind,
Right.
that they weren't planning to come
Yeah.
back to the surface. Um, but yeah, it's so important, and it's talking about that. I think that writers who live in the Southwest, I think we write really good climate fiction.
I hope so. We'll find out.
So in terms of, so we've got Echo coming out. We've got next. Is it next year going to be the next book in the Between the Earth and Sky series?
Hopefully, yes. Yeah.
Nice. So that's exciting. Do I have any questions? Do you want to open it up to
Sure.
Q&A
Yeah,
for
yeah, yeah.
from the
Anybody has
audience?
questions?
This is our chance. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
I was wondering what your characters are so wonderful and deep and multifaceted. I just love them. And your villains are great too. Do you have a favorite character you've written so far?
Oh gosh, it varies from day to day. Um, I do really love Serapio. He is sort of my heart. I mean, I am not, I am not him, but there's a lot of me in him. There's a lot of me in all my characters. Actually, I'll take like one element and sort of blow it up, and like exaggerate it. So certainly, it's not like there's a lot. What am I trying to say? Lots of people think like, oh, authors, they're just doing these writer inserts into their characters, but it's not that. It's that you take one element that you know well, or one issue that. Like I talk a lot about identity and belonging and all that sort of stuff because that means something to me. That's what really drives a lot of my fiction, and then I sort of like blow it up. So I love him, but I love Shiala too. She's sort of I always joke that she's like me in my 20s,
Mhm.
just a hot mess. And so she's a lot of fun, but I love Narampa because she is like I always describe her as a woman who loves an institution that doesn't love her back. And is trying so desperately like to fit in and to make it work, and it's just never going to work because she's from the wrong side of the tracks. She's just not one of them, one of the elites, and that was very much I feel like my experiences in the Ivy League and in law school, and all of that goes into that. um but then I love Maggie and Kai too, like that there's really my first babies. And I even like Celeste. She's a lot in this book, but I really have come to love her too.
I've got to say, this is a little bit of a departure for you because it's an incredibly dark book. Um, do you enjoy that piece of it? Do you enjoy getting into the dark and the gritty? Because this is probably the grittiest book I think I've ever read of yours.
Oh, wow. Yes. I think all my books are dark. All my work is sort of dark. Because I am dark inside. My daughter would say that makes you emo, not cool. But um, yeah, this is a noir. So I think this is really inspired by sort of the noir genre, where all the characters are gray. Nobody's really good, and it's not going to end well for anyone involved. And so that was sort of my take on this. Like I want. So in that way, yes, I think it is maybe perhaps the grittiest thing I've read. But it's only 200 pages of grit, and hopefully there are sort of lighter moments, although maybe not a lot.
But 200 pages, I mean, it's not just 200 pages. It is a full-blown gut-punching story that you have written from beginning to end, and so well worth your time, and a great in-between read from your series. So I mean, it's very welcome. So anytime we can get more of your writing, we're happy.
Thank you. That's very nice.
Any other questions from the audience? Patrick, anybody from Facebook?
Yeah, even now. Yeah, when we were I was just in Seattle earlier in the week, and all the news was about how there's no rain. Like, what are we doing in November? And there's no rain, and it's too warm. And so they were, yeah. So maybe they're already seeding the clouds. Maybe the government's already up to like shenanigans, and we just don't know. Yes, I've read The Water Knife. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very cool. Yeah, definitely an influence on the next book.
All right. Oh,
Very important.
thank you very much for a little Paul love. Paul loves getting on, and for those of you who are wanting to support Paul, of course you can buy Tread of Angels from the Poison Pen.
Paul has read it, and he said it was quality.
Oh, there we go. He heard his name. He's doing a run on.
He is. What a sweetie. Oh, that's a great question. Gosh. So this year, let's see. I really loved R.F. Kuang's Babel. If you haven't read that, I thought that was amazing. I think she really upped her game from the Poppy War trilogy. Like this is just next level stuff. I love P. Jelly Clark. If you've read Master of Jen, basically everything he writes is just. I think I was like, when I talk about him, I'm always like, I wish I had an imagination like that. Like his imagination is just fantastic. He wrote like a 1920s steampunk Cairo, and that's what Master of Jen is. And so that was
Great mystery too.
yeah, and a
It
great
really is.
mystery. Yeah, I think I even shout him out in the back of this. I was like, he wrote a mystery. I could write a mystery. So he inspired me. I really liked Genesis of Misery by Neon Yang. It is a crazy space opera, sort of Gideon the Ninth meets. What did I describe it as? Oh, I can't remember. What's the movie? Oh shoot, with the mecha, the mech, and they get in the Pacific Rim.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So Gideon the Ninth meets Pacific Rim, but it's all about sort of uh, 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 um, non-binary character who believes they are chosen as the Messiah. So there's a lot of like religion vibes in there, and then it all goes really wrong or right. I don't know. I guess it depends on which side of the war you're on, but it's really, really good and just kind of balls out crazy. I don't know how else to explain it. Awesome.
So many great writers out there right now. Such good books. I just finished Daniel O'Malley's Blitz, which is World War II meets superheroes meets the X
Mm.
Files. So a lot of fun. A lot of fun. P, any more?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I love craft questions. If anyone has craft questions, please feel free to ask. So I came to writing late. Like I said, I had, other careers and I was just writing really for my own pleasure or for my own sanity, honestly. Like when I wrote my first novel, I was working full time as a lawyer. I had a 2-year-old daughter. And so I was just looking for like, and I hated my job. And so I was just looking, for a place that was like sort of mine. And writing was always my happy place. So from like 10 p.m. at night to 2 a.m. in the morning, I would sit by my daughter's bedside and I would just write. And that was Trail of Lightning. And I had joined a NaNoWriMo group to kind of force me to go and write on Saturdays and to have like people around. And that's National Novel Writing Month, if you don't know, where people, just everyday people, try to write a novel. And after I finished, I hung out with that group. I still hung out with that 3 or 4 women who were, some were published, but like one was an academic writer and then one was a romance writer. But we were all writing something and they encouraged me to query. And I didn't know anything about publishing. I mean, I live in New Mexico. Like, it's not like you're in the hub of like New York or what's publishing, and it was not part of my world. But I did my research. I found an agent that I thought might be interested, and I sent the manuscript into what they call the slush. And my agent said she gets about 30,000 submissions a year, and she picks about five, and she picked mine.
That's exciting.
And so, yeah, it just kind of worked out. So I guess what I would say to like aspiring writers is write the story that you can write. So they're all ideas are pretty much out there in the ether. Like there's no real original ideas per se. You're gonna have like, coming of age, or you're gonna have romance, or whatever that is. But only you can tell the story the way that you conceive of it. Only you bring your experiences and your life to the table. And so you need to tap into that. Don't be afraid to, then they say like bleed on the page, but it is kind of true. Don't be afraid to sort of bare your soul on the page, um, and write the story that you could write, and that you want to read. That you want to be out in the world. And don't try to write to market. Don't try to be like, oh, I don't know, vampires are great, cool right now. So let me write vampires, because at the time your book comes out, vampires aren't going to be cool anymore. Because it takes about 18 months from like sell to like shelf, if you're going the traditional publishing route. And just write for pleasure, right? Because it makes you happy and you enjoy it. And, hopefully, things come together. And the more you write, the better you get, hopefully, if you're lucky. So don't be afraid to like take some chances too.
Every author I've heard, they've always said, finish your book.
Oh yes,
Because
and
you
finish your book.
can't sell anything that's not finished, right?
100%.
And you learn so much from that writing. And as our store owner Barbara says, plot can be fixed, but if you don't have something finished, there's nothing to fix.
Right. And finishing is the hardest part. Starting is easy. Everybody has, that dozen ideas. You're like, oh, what if I do this? What if there's salt and then they need the salt? But then how's it going to end? And so that's by far the most difficult part of writing.
So I've got to say, as a novelist, a novellist, and a short story writer, which form do you prefer now?
Oh, I think I prefer the novel. I think I still prefer the novel. I think at heart I'm a world builder, and I love sort of expansive world building, and I like character arcs. And so novels really give you space to grow a character, to let them develop, to let them make mistakes, to learn or not learn from those mistakes, and then sort of deal with the consequences of their actions, which is my favorite.
Well, and you do. You really make them suffer a little bit. You like your characters suffering a little bit.
Life is suffering.
Well, fantastic. After a while, these chairs become suddenly uncomfortable. They're the Southern Comfort brand, which means suddenly your butt goes numb. So, for the sake of our audience and for them to get a chance to chat with you a little bit one-on-one, one of the advantages of coming to the Poison Pen, we'll go ahead and end the interview here for our audience. Thank you so much. Rebecca, for our audience, where can they find you?
You can find me at RebeccaRoanhorse.com. I do have a newsletter. I have recently, like so many others, left Twitter, so don't look for me there. But you can sign up for the newsletter, and you can get all the giveaways and most recent releases and all of that stuff.
And remember that you can get a signed book, A Tread of Angels from us, the Poison Pen. Of course, a purchase of a book is your vote for more science fiction and fantasy events here at the Pen, and also helps keep the doors open, helps keep us employed, keeps Paul and Kibble. So, everybody, thank you so much, and have a great evening.